Welcome to Heartbreaker, your love radio. The Harrisons' house in the Seattle suburbs was a family haven. The well-kept lawn and the swing in the backyard for Mason were witnesses to peaceful days. Despite loving her son and husband, Chris, Megan felt something was missing. She dreamed of more creative freedom, something her administrative assistant routine simply didn't provide. Have you ever thought about trying something new? Megan asked Chris as they finished clearing the table after dinner. Chris looked at her for a moment, intrigued. Like what? Something creative, something different. I was thinking of opening an OnlyFans account. Just to explore a more artistic side, you know? She gave a slight smile, trying to gauge his reaction. Chris let out a short laugh. OnlyFans? Really, Meg? Isn't that the site where people, well, you know? Yes, I know. But it doesn't have to be that explicit. I was thinking of doing some suggestive photos just to see how it goes. Don't you think that's a bit risky? She sighed. Maybe. But what if I just try it? It could be fun. Chris shrugged, unconvinced. Well, as long as you don't do anything you'll regret. She smiled and wrapped her arms around him. I promise. I just want to try something new. In the following days, Megan began posting lingerie photos and poses that highlighted her curves. Chris didn't find it amusing, but he also didn't care that much, thinking it would soon pass. After all, Megan always got excited about new projects and eventually lost interest. However, over time, Megan became more involved, buying photography equipment and creating a space at home for her shoots. Chris watched her getting excited about the increasing number of subscribers and the compliments she received. He tried to support her, but he began to feel uncomfortable with the attention she was getting. Do you think you're going a bit overboard, Meg? Chris asked one night while Mason was asleep and she was editing photos on the laptop. Overboard how? Megan stopped and looked at him, surprised. I don't know, it's just getting a little too much for me. She scoffed, not believing it. Chris, it's just a hobby. I'm having fun and I'm making some extra money. What's the problem? He hesitated, trying to find the words. I just don't want you to do something that could harm us. A harm? Who exactly is being harmed here? She crossed her arms, already becoming defensive. I just want to make sure Mason grows up in a safe environment, Meg. You think I'm going to harm our son? Her voice rose an octave. That's ridiculous, Chris. I'm just saying to be careful, okay? She turned her back on him, already tired of the argument. Let's talk about this another time. Chris watched as she returned to the laptop, her face immersed in the glow of the screen. He sighed but let the discussion cool off for now. The room Megan used for work was filled with cameras, ring lights, and different types of costumes. She made a point of creating new settings for each shoot, improving the quality of the photos, and catering to the increasingly daring requests from her followers. Her earnings increased substantially, and after a few weeks, what was once just a hobby had become a significant source of income. One evening after dinner, Megan was editing her photos on the laptop when Chris approached. He looked at the images on the screen and frowned. This seems a bit more explicit than before. Megan turned to him with a defensive tone. Chris, it's what people are asking for. And you know what that means? More subscribers and more money. But do you need to go that far? We're already making enough. I'm not hurting anyone and I'm having fun. It's not like I'm doing anything illegal. Chris crossed his arms, trying to control his frustration. And do you think it's healthy for our family? Megan, Mason is starting to notice more things around us. She sighed. You always bring Mason into this. He's fine, Chris. He doesn't even know what I'm doing. Plus, the extra money could be useful for him too. I just want us to be careful with this. You're exposing yourself too much. Megan shook her head, irritated. Chris, we've already had this conversation. I know what I'm doing. Chris was silent for a moment, then shook his head. All right, Megan. But I hope you really know what you're doing. She didn't respond, turning back to the screen with her jaw clenched, as if ignoring Chris's warnings was the only possible response. In the following weeks, Megan continued to immerse herself in the new world. Her photos became increasingly explicit and her followers more demanding. She felt powerful controlling her career and earnings, but the distance between her and Chris grew with every click of the camera. What was once a hobby became an obsession that infiltrated her nights and weekends. One afternoon, while Chris was tidying up Mason's toys in the living room, he tried once again to talk to Megan. "Megan, can we talk about what's going on here?" She looked at him impatient. "About what exactly?" "You're devoting so much time to this profile that you barely spend time with Mason anymore. He's been asking why you don't take him to the park anymore." "I'm working, Chris. This is my job now." And where does our family fit into all of this?" She scoffed. "You're just being controlling. I'm finally doing something for myself and you can't handle it." Chris held back his frustration and tried to keep his voice calm. "It's not about control. It's about our family. About Mason. You need to understand that." Megan stepped away from him, irritation evident in her eyes. "I understand perfectly. I just don't need your approval to live my life." Chris watched as she went up the stairs, her presence growing more distant with each step. He knew something was breaking between them, but he couldn't find the right words to stop it. The tension between Megan and Chris became palpable. Their relationship, once marked by laughter and light conversations, deteriorated into tense arguments and uncomfortable silences. Chris, increasingly uncomfortable with the explicit content Megan was producing, decided to have a serious conversation with her one night after putting Mason to bed. "Megan, we need to talk." He called her into the kitchen as she washed the dishes. Megan dried her hands on the towel and stared at him, already expecting another criticism. "About what now?" "I'm not comfortable with the direction this is going." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I know you're excited about the money and the followers, but I'm worried about the impact this could have on our family. You keep harping on this." Megan crossed her arms, irritated. Why do you think this will harm us so much?" "Because you're changing. You barely spend time with us and Mason notices it." She let out an exasperated sigh. Chris, that's not fair. I'm working to secure our future. You know that." "I do, but what about the present? Mason is already asking why you don't take him to the park anymore or spend time playing with him." Megan shook her head. He's exaggerating. I'm always around, you know that." Chris tried to keep his voice calm. But not in the way he needs, Megan. And I don't feel comfortable with the exposure you're facing either." She looked at him with a mixture of fatigue and disbelief. "You're being controlling, Chris. You want to keep me in a box so that nothing changes." "It's not about control." He kept his voice low and steady. "It's about the impact this has on our family." Megan narrowed her eyes. And what do you suggest? That I give up everything because you can't handle it?" "I suggest you reconsider your choices. That you consider the potential effects of all this, especially for Mason." She scoffed and backed away. "I'm not going to give up my job just to appease your insecurities." Chris felt frustration growing inside him, but he kept his tone serene. "I'm not asking you to give up. I'm asking you to be more careful." Megan turned to him, shaking her head. "I'm an adult, Chris. And I can make my own decisions." Chris didn't respond, realizing that any further words would be in vain. He watched Megan return to the laptop in the living room, the bluish light reflecting on her determined features. The tension in Megan and Chris's marriage was already noticeable when Megan's family began to suspect that something was wrong. Megan's parents, Carol and David, in the suburbs of Seattle, had always been a welcoming place for Megan, but recently, her visits had become rarer. When the family gathered, Megan tried to avoid questions about her work and quickly changed the subject, but her parents noticed the hesitation and concern in her eyes. One Saturday, Carol and David invited Megan, Chris, and Mason for dinner. The table was set and Carol had prepared all of her daughter's favorite foods, trying to create a pleasant atmosphere. But the light mood didn't last. Carol couldn't resist the silence anymore, and between bites, she asked a question. Megan, how's your job going? Megan smiled and answered cautiously. It's going well, Mom. I've been exploring new opportunities. David frowned. Have you ever thought about quitting this OnlyFans thing? It doesn't seem like something you really need to do. Chris, upon hearing this, set his fork down on the table and nodded, trying to support David's statement without being too direct. They're right, Meg. You might consider other options. Megan scoffed, crossing her arms and staring at her parents. And why do you think you have the right to tell me how to work? Carol sighed. It's not about rights, honey. It's about concern. What you're doing could harm Mason. Harm Mason? Megan's voice rose a few octaves. How exactly? David cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. You're exposing yourself too much, and Chris has told us about some of the messages you've been receiving. This could cause problems in the future. Megan turned to Chris with a surprised and angry expression. You told them about this? Chris tried to stay calm. They asked Meg. They were concerned. Megan clenched her fists, tears starting to shimmer in her eyes. You have no idea what it's like to live through this. Did you really think you could get together and decide what's best for me? As sweetheart, we just want to help you, Carol tried to soften. Help? Is this your idea of help? Judging me and questioning my decisions? Megan stood up, pushing her chair back.
David reached out to her. We're not judging, just trying to protect our family. Megan looked at them, breathing heavily. You think you need to protect me. But I don't want, nor need that. She turned and left the dining room, leaving Chris and her parents behind, feeling a mix of anger and concern. Chris looked at his in-laws, and David let out a tired sigh. She needs to understand that we only want what's best. Chris nodded, but he knew that the distance between him and Megan was only growing, and he feared that his concern wouldn't be enough to prevent what was to come. Days at home became a game of silent endurance. Chris avoided Megan, trying to create a sense of normalcy for Mason, but the discomfort between the parents didn't go unnoticed by the boy. Finally, after a series of heated arguments and sleepless nights, Chris decided he'd had enough. He sought out a lawyer, gathered the necessary documents, and one night, called Megan into the living room for a final conversation. Megan, we need to talk about Mason, Chris began, trying to keep his tone as neutral as possible. Megan looked at him, surprised. About what, specifically? About what we're doing here, he sighed. I want a divorce. Megan remained silent for a moment, absorbing his words. Are you serious? Yes. We can't keep living like this, and I want custody of Mason. Her eyes narrowed in disbelief. You want custody of Mason? Why? Because of your job. The images you post, the conversations you have with your followers. I don't want our son growing up in that environment. She crossed her arms, frustration evident. So that's it? You want to take Mason away from me because you don't agree with what I do for a living. It's not just about that, Chris insisted, trying to contain his anger. It's about what it could do to Mason. He deserves a stable home. Megan felt her blood boil. You think I can't be a good mother? That I can't raise our child? Chris shook his head. I know you love him, but you can't separate work from personal life anymore. Your focus is elsewhere. Megan clenched her fists. And you think this is fair? That taking Mason away from me is the best solution. I'm trying to do what's right for him, Chris said firmly. You don't understand the impact this could have on our son. She turned her face away, looking at the wall. You're exaggerating.
No, Megan.
I'm being realistic. She turned back to him, tears in her eyes. You want to destroy everything we've built together? Chris fell silent, at a loss for words to ease the pain he saw in her eyes. I don't want to destroy anything. I want to protect Mason. Megan crossed her arms and looked at him coldly. You'll regret this, Chris. He sighed. I hope not, but I can't go on like this. Without another word, she left the room, ascending the stairs with determined steps. At that moment, they both knew the battle was just beginning. In court, Megan's and Chris's lawyers exchanged sharp arguments, each side trying to portray the other as less fit to raise Mason. The case soon caught the attention of the local media, which quickly spread the narrative of a couple in conflict over moral values and what constituted a safe home. Chris's lawyer, John, didn't mince words in his argument. Megan's online behavior is inappropriate for a mother raising a young boy. Her explicit content and exposure on social media could harm Mason, both now and in the future. Megan's lawyer, Sarah, countered, "This is absurd. Megan loves her son and can raise Mason safely. Her job doesn't define her as a mother." When Megan took the witness stand, she looked directly at Chris before speaking. "I'm here today because I can't lose my son. I love Mason, and I've always taken care to separate my work from our family life. I am a good mother." Chris also testified, speaking with conviction. "I know Megan loves Mason, but she's so involved in this work that she doesn't realize the impact it can have on his life. I'm seeking primary custody because I want him to have stability and a healthy environment to grow up in." The days of hearings were a test of endurance. Megan tried to maintain her presence on OnlyFans while responding to legal challenges. The pressure mounted, with journalists waiting outside the courthouse, asking embarrassing questions about her personal life. After weeks of argumentation, the court's decision was clear. The judge banged the gavel, ruling in favor of Chris. The court concludes that it is in the best interest of the child to grant primary custody to the father, Chris Harrison. The mother, Megan Harrison, will have supervised visitation. Megan remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. The judge's words echoed in her mind as Chris approached her, extending his hand.
"I'm sorry, Megan.
This isn't easy for me either." She looked at him with anger, pushing his hand away. "You'll never understand what you've done. Never." Chris stepped back, shaking his head sadly before leaving the courtroom with Mason. Megan watched her son walk away, tears in her eyes. She didn't understand how her life had come to this point, but the reality was now before her, undeniable. The decision to grant primary custody to Chris, leaving her with only supervised visits, left her devastated. But, determined to move forward, she continued to produce content for her followers on OnlyFans. It was the only source of stability she had left. One night, during a live stream, Megan put on a smile and started talking to the viewers, answering questions and interacting with them. She wanted to appear strong, as she always did, but the hurt was visible in her eyes. In the middle of the session, a message popped up on the screen. "See, how's your son?" Megan quickly read the message and tried to ignore it, but she couldn't control the trembling in her hands. Another cruel message followed. "The court judged you poorly? But we judge you very well, delicious." She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. Guys, now's not the time for questions like that. Come on, Megan? Let's be realistic. Why don't you talk about it?" Her attempt to ignore the comments didn't work, and more people started asking similar questions. The viewers' coldness and cruelty were relentless, using her pain and vulnerability as a joke. Megan abruptly ended the stream, barely holding back the tears. As she turned off the camera, she allowed herself to collapse. The followers' jokes and the relentless judgments of others mingled with a feeling of loss, making her feel more alone than ever. She realized that the exposure that once empowered her now made her feel defenseless. In an act of determination, Megan decided to disconnect for a while. The silent house was an empty, cold place for Megan. Mason's room seemed untouched, as if waiting for her return at any moment. She spent hours there, looking at the scattered toys, but without her son's laughter to fill the silence, the pain settled in deeply. The money and praise she continued to receive online meant little when her family was no longer around. After a few weeks of loneliness and regret, Megan finally picked up the phone and called Chris. He answered cautiously.
Hello.
Hey Chris, it's me. We need to talk. What do you want, Megan? I want to apologize. I'm sorry for everything that happened. Chris took a deep breath before responding. Okay. But what do you expect me to do with that now? Megan closed her eyes, trying to stay calm. I'm willing to change. I know I made mistakes, and I want to make things right. Let's try again. Megan, you can't undo the past. Chris's voice was firm. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. She felt tears welling up. But Mason. Mason is fine with me. He can still see you, but under supervision, as the court determined. Chris, please. I'm so sorry. I'll stop everything, I promise. Megan, I can't go back. I've made my decision, and I won't risk Mason's well-being. He needs stability. The phone was silent for a few seconds before Megan spoke again, her voice now trembling. So you're not going to give me a chance? I'm not. The response came without hesitation. After the call ended, Megan stared at the phone, tears finally streaming down her face. Chris had been firm and clear, but she wasn't ready to accept that her family was truly out of reach. She tried to drown her pain in more work and more online presence, but the nights were long and lonely. Days passed, and Megan saw Chris and Mason a few times during supervised visits. She tried to put on a positive face for her son, but the tension between her and Chris was palpable. Megan tried to face the future, but the regret of what she had lost haunted her. In their new home, Chris found an unexpected peace alongside Mason. He began to cherish the simple moments, like making breakfast together and helping him with homework. One evening, after Mason finished painting a drawing, Chris approached with a smile. That's amazing, son. You drew our dog really well. Mason looked at the paper proudly. I think he needs a red leash. Good idea. Let's draw one, Chris agreed, handing him the correct pencil. They laughed as they finished the drawing. Later, Chris read a bedtime story to Mason. When he closed the book and left the room, he felt a quiet satisfaction. At work, Chris was also excelling. He focused on important projects and took on new responsibilities. Colleagues noticed the difference, and his manager even called him in for a chat. Chris, your dedication has been exemplary lately. How do you feel about a new position on the team? Chris was surprised but smiled. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm ready to take it on. As Chris found his stride, Megan grappled with the weight of loneliness. Her apartment felt like an empty space, even as she worked to please her followers. The supportive messages she received no longer offered solace. On a sunny Saturday, Megan met him in the park under the watchful eye of the social worker supervising the visit. Mason ran to his mother with a smile, and she enveloped him in a warm hug, feeling his small body against hers. Sham. Ready to play a bit? He nodded eagerly. Shall we go on the swing, Mom? Of course, she replied, holding his hand as they walked towards the playground. For a few hours, they played together, smiling and laughing like in the old days. Megan pushed Mason on the swing, both exchanging joyful glances, but she couldn't help the sadness and anxiety that lingered in her chest. After swinging, they sat on the grass for a snack. Mason talked about the activities he did at school, while Megan listened attentively, struggling to contain the sadness that tried to surface. "I made a drawing yesterday," Mason said excitedly. "It was of you and Dad, all together." Megan bit her lip to hold back the tears. "Will you show it to me next time we meet?" "I will," Mason replied. "You can hang it on your fridge." She smiled, squeezing him in a tight hug, wishing the moment could last forever. But soon the social worker announced that it was time to end the visit, and Mason ran back into Chris's arms, who was waiting for him on the other side of the park. As she watched them walk away, Megan felt a deep loneliness settle in once again. The empty apartment awaited her, cold and impersonal. She entered, took off her shoes, and walked to the window, where the city stretched out in the distance. She felt disconnected, seeing her reflection in the glass. Money and fame couldn't fill the void left by Mason's loss. The online messages of support seemed empty and superficial in the silence of the apartment. Mason's laughter and smile still echoed in her mind, but there was no way to fill his absence. Megan knew that no matter how hard she tried to rebuild her life, she would always feel the weight of the choices that drove her away from her son. She sighed, sitting on the couch, wishing she could turn back time and correct her mistakes. One evening, she confided in a close friend, Sarah, as they shared a dinner. "I feel so lost. I know I chose this path, but I didn't know it would cost me so much." "You still have time to rebuild, Megan," as Sarah tried to cheer her up. "Starting over will be hard, but you don't have to do it alone." Megan squeezed her friend's hand, grateful. Thank you. I'll try to find a new direction." She began to explore other types of work and attend support groups. She was determined to rebuild herself for Mason, so that he could have a present and positive mother. Chris and Megan never returned to how they were before, but they found a way to coexist for Mason's sake. They both learned to value what really mattered, even if on separate paths. The pain of past choices still existed, but there was also room for new beginnings.